I thought I would start with a quote. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Martin Luther King said this during the Civil Rights Revolution in the US. And if you look at Bill 104 and the Tamil activist community in Canada, you can really see that this arc that bends towards justice, it doesn't bend by itself. Activists bend it. The community bends it. The politicians working with the activists and community bend it. At the same time, you can also see in the 15 years since Mullivaikkal, geopolitics can also bend the arc in another direction. And so this talk, I'm going to talk about maybe 15 minutes, and trying to bridge the gap between the political consensus in Canada around genocide and a legal roadmap to get from today to taking Sri Lanka to the ICJ for genocide. Yeah. So the first observation is now is a good time. This year, next year, the following year, it's a good time to focus on genocide accountability. All resources are finite, attention shifts. It's already 15 years since 2009. It's 40 years since Black July. It's 75 years since 1948. The injustices impacting the Tamil community are multi-generational. They really go back to the formation of the Sri Lankan state. And for example, in the year 2063, in another 40 years, it'll be too late. The witnesses won't be there. Some of us in the room might not be there either. So, these are things we should sort of focus our attention on now. One of the hurdles to actually getting from political consensus to a clear legal roadmap is, broadly speaking, the Tamil legal community has largely been absent in Tamil activism. So you have a backlog of injustice, going back multiple years, but I have faith that working with the various Tamil activist orgs, we can sort of overcome these gaps in a pretty short time. So if you think about getting from today to ICJ as a puzzle, there's going to be certain missing pieces that are out of our control. For example, the Sri Lankan state is not going to give any evidence. Some of the states in the international community that supported the armed conflict, they're not going to declassify any of their intelligence either. And so those are things we don't necessarily need to worry about, and I don't see them as roadblocks. The two things that we can focus on are the two things that Canada's legal team would need to move from today to get to the ICJ. And this is standard for any sort of criminal proceeding. You need evidence and you need a legal argument. The rest of this talk is basically divided into three parts: facts, evidence, and law. And I'm really going to focus on the facts and evidence. One thing that Third Eye has been doing over the last 2 years is interviewing witnesses. So we've interviewed around 100 survivors from May 2009. I've personally taken video depositions of about 50 people who survived in May 2009. And it's really their story that needs to be the foundation of any movement towards the ICJ. So this is just to give everyone an orientation. So this is northern Sri Lanka. If you can see the pink horizontal square, that represents the Venni region, about 15,000 square kilometers. Prior to 2009, there were 400,000 Tamils living there in basically a de facto state. So you can see when you go from that to no-fire zone 3 was 400 meters by 600 meters. So you're taking 400,000 people who were living in 15,000 square kilometers and pushing them through sequentially smaller no-fire zones into a 400 meter by 600 meter box. The gray area is actually the time period from mid-May to mid-June. This is when Tamils were forced to surrender, and there was no oversight by the UN or NGOs during this period. This is something, again, we found out from the witnesses, and it's not in any public domain reporting. So to reset the time frame, instead of focusing on, war on terror, Tamils are trapped, human shields, like everyone has read the narratives in the mainstream media, we tried to take a broader view that includes, all of the history relevant to the Tamil issue, and basically work from there to the genocide argument. Like start from the ground truth, what actually happened, and see what the genocide argument looks like. So the first relevant milestone is the EU ban. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about the EU ban of the LTT, but basically, you can conceptualize the EU ban as the lead domino in a domino effect that went from the peace process to Mullivaigal. When the EU banned the LTTE, the EU also banned Norway mediating the peace process. The EU also banned peacekeeping operations in Sri Lanka. And when you have an active war and you remove peacekeepers, what's going to happen? The war's going to increase, right? So the EU ban is the lead domino, and then we can see that it collapsed the peace process, war escalated, and then we ended at May 2009. The real question to ask about the LTT ban is not whether you supported the LTT or against the LTT. It's not about is it legitimate or not. It's how did Sri Lanka use the ban once it was in place? Did Sri Lanka use the ban to target LTT's military wing, or did Sri Lanka use the ban to destroy the fabric of life in the Venni region? And I think the facts speak for themselves. So I'm going to linger on this slide because it's probably the most important one in this talk. Now, it's a timeline of what I think the real factual narrative should be for a Tamil genocide argument. So this is what, if there's political consensus in Canada, the Canada's legal team is going to need the right factual narrative and the legal argument to get to the ICJ and not only file but win. And so for that, we need to define what the ground truth is. Now the time period here is May 2006 to May 2009. If you look to the right of the red line, everyone is familiar with that narrative. There's 3 no-fire zones. January 2009, then in February and March, there's no-fire zone 2, no-fire zone 3, and everyone's familiar with that. Now, most of the facts to the left of the vertical red line, they have not been reported anywhere, and this is what we basically extrapolated from about 100 witness interviews of Tamils who survived May 2009, and now they're living in the diaspora. Some of them are still in Sri Lanka. And my recommendation for a proper genocide argument, I think it has 7 stages. So the first stage is the EU ban, which collapsed the peace process and war started. The second phase is Sri Lanka started attacking NGOs in 2007 and also removed journalists. So that's the sort of purple boxes. So what this does is it removes the witnesses. So by the time you get to 2009, there's only Tamils in the Venni region. All the NGOs, all the journalists are out. Now, the next thing that we learned from the medical team was that the Sri Lankan government actually withdrew the government doctors before 2009, right? And why is that? Because if you have more casualty patients and not enough doctors, you can't treat everybody, and there's a higher probability the injured will die. So EU ban, attacks on NGOs, journalists are out, and then now remove the government doctors. Now, the last part is pretty important. So Sri Lanka also cut all medical supplies going into Venni. It specifically it stopped the supply of medicines needed to treat the injuries caused by the weapons it was using. So the doctor said, you need blood bags, you need bandages, you need IV fluids to treat shelling injuries, cluster munition injuries. So these supplies were cut before January 2009. Now, food was also cut and water was cut. These were cut at Omandai checkpoint, which is the main road going into the Venni region. And so if you're cutting supplies there, you cannot distinguish between combatant and civilian. That's everybody in Venni. And so, all these events from the left from May 2006 to January 2009, they're unfortunately not in any UN reporting, any INGO reporting. One reason for that is Sri Lanka also blocked access to fact-finding. And so these facts are very relevant and material to make a genocide case. And so, yeah, I wanted to lay that out, that the stuff on the left side of the vertical line are things that I will recommend some of the activist community focus on in the next year. So another common pattern, again, the factual complexity is just too much for me to really convey in 15, 20 minutes, so I'm just trying to get the main themes out. So the 400,000 Tamil families, they basically, you know, the narrative that kept coming up is you're just moving from bunker to bunker, you know, 10, 15 times. So it basically felt like a hopscotch, you know. So let's say if you're in bunker 4, you need to figure out how to get to 5 and 6. If there's a bunker there, you use it. If there's not, you make one. And meanwhile, the people behind you are now using your bunker, right? And this is how everyone was moving from January 2009 to May 2009. The common theme was they're basically moving away from shelling and towards wherever the next hospital is. Now, the one sort of disturbing thing that also came up is in each bunker, you will have multiple generations of one family. So mother, father, you know, children, aunt, cousin, grandmother. So one shell can erase, you know, 3, 4 generations of the same family. This seems to be a common pattern, and it increased as the population density increased. So section 2 now so that's sort of, you know, the broader narrative that EU ban happened, Sri Lanka removed the doctors, Sri Lanka cut the medical supplies, Sri Lanka removed the witnesses, and now you can basically attack the no-fire zones and control the narrative. My estimation is there's about 40% of the ground truth is not in any reporting. I think 99% of the survivors of Mullivaigal haven't been interviewed by anybody. And just to give you a sort of a footnote, so I spoke to a UN official who worked on one of the UN reports on Sri Lanka after Mullivaigal. And so what's also not in public is, so Sri Lanka didn't allow any investigations inside Sri Lanka. So the UN reporting is generally based on 200 to 300 refugees in Europe. Now, if you think about that, is 300 survivors, and your sample size is 300. So the narrative is based on 0.1%. And, you know, this is insufficient to rule out genocide happened. And, you know, it just makes me feel that Canada and the activists here are on the right track. Yeah, I mean, this is just you know, the overlap is not enough. The overlap is not enough. 2 years ago, I was asked to assess, Rajeev, can we prove genocide? And I looked at the UN reporting, and I had some doubts. You know, I had some doubts because I didn't see, it looked like war crimes, it looked like other factors. And so to verify the doubts, I said, all right, let's talk to a small sample of witnesses. And that's what sort of led us on this trail, you know, 2 years later to find out, okay, if we talk to the witnesses, the genocide argument will become stronger by probably 10 to 15-fold. And yeah, and so I'll just read, you know, since this is a family event, I'm not going to get into the graphic details, but I'll just read summaries of what the witnesses told me in the various interviews. So I already mentioned Sri Lanka cut the supply chain. They removed the NGOs. Now, paralysis of medical infrastructure, what does this mean? So how do you paralyze medical infrastructure? You get the doctors out, you deny medicine. Now, you also attack the ambulances that can transport civilians to the hospital, then you attack the hospital. So all of this was happening. Weaponization of food. So this was a constant issue for all the families. trying to figure out how to get water, how to get food. Sri Lanka would also target water tanks, and there were queues for Kenji. Any way to stop food getting to Tamils, Sri Lanka would figure out how it was happening and attack that. Drone-based military ops were normal. So it's surprising for me to see this isn't mentioned anywhere. Like literally every witness says, the drone comes, the drone leaves, there's an attack. The drone comes, the drone leaves, there's an attack. And it's nowhere in the UN INGO reporting. So somebody's leaving something out. Airstrikes, cluster munitions. From one story, some of the cluster munitions had pink ribbons, because the cluster munitions pretty much, if it's 20 bombs, it's small bombs, 10 burst in the sky, 10 fall to the ground and they burst when you touch it, and they put the pink ribbon so that children would get curious and try to open it. Indiscriminate rifle fire. In no-fire zone 3, the Red Cross refused to treat wounded Tamils. So you can see, for me, I do this on a volunteer basis. I was asked to review, can I improve the genocide argument 2 years ago, and you keep talking to people, and this is a nightmare. Like so many things went wrong, you don't really know how to fix it. Tamils were killed when they were surrendering. For example, in Nandikadal, there are bodies in Nandikadal. Multiple witnesses spoke about that. So from this list, 1 through 8 was happening throughout 2009 and nobody wrote about it. We can go to that. So one of my lessons learned is, if you want to commit genocide and get away with it, you should block the fact-finding. And then you can control the narrative, and if no one interviews the witnesses, that's sort of what happened to the Tamil people between 2009 and today. Now, at the okay, this is sort of the negative side. Here's the optimistic spin, is that the basic business model for reporting is something that the diaspora can do. So if you take the UN or Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, they're getting funding, they do investigations, and they make a report, and they do advocacy. Now, right now, most of the Tamil activist community, it's pretty much piggybacking the UN INGO reports, which is fine. It's fine if those reports contain most of the facts. But when they don't, there's a gap. There's a gap, and the good news is the witnesses are ready to tell their story. And so this is something that the activist community can do because the UN and INGOs, they don't monopolize, telling the truth. And so once you begin to speak to the witnesses, you get a different understanding of what is in the UN INGO reports. And pretty much they will analyze individual crimes. This hospital was attacked, or the shell fell over there, but they won't connect the dots. So they won't tell you, actually, before the hospital was attacked, Sri Lanka already moved the doctors out and cut the medical supplies. And so part of the genocide argument is really, it's not about the technicalities of what the genocide law says. It's really about telling the ground truth of what the witnesses remember. And if we just, pretty much just connect the dots, you'll get to the genocide argument. Okay, and section 3. So this is the last section. Yeah, okay. So I'll explain this. It might not be that interesting, but it is sort of relevant to understand how the genocide issues reported. So everyone has been at a road with 2 or 3 traffic lights. And the reason there's no car crashes is the red lights come at a certain time, the green lights come at a certain time, and you know when to stop and you know when to go. Now, if the red lights were coming at different times and the green lights were coming at different times, you would get more car crashes. Everyone's confused because you don't have a coherent signal. In international law, this is called harmonization. You have different laws, but you need like one red light, one green light. And so for genocide, laws of war, and terrorism, there's no harmonization. It's 3 traffic lights, going at different, their own schedule. And so this is how you can have Sri Lanka talking about war on terror, the UN talking about laws of war, and the Tamil community saying, hey, that was genocide, right? There's no coherence. And so just understanding this helps prepare for the ICJ trial, because pretty much we know what Sri Lanka is going to argue. Canada will say genocide happened. Sri Lanka will say, no, it's collateral damage, or no, it was the war on terror. And so if we now look at this diagram, you have black people representing humans on the left and yellow. Now, assume in the box, everybody's Tamil. So, and let's say the black is combatant, yellow is civilian, right? So one way that could be narrated is, oh, that's collateral damage, right? I targeted combatants and civilian side. But civilian or combatant, it's a dead Tamil person. I mean, however you divide, everyone in Vanni at that point was Tamil. And so this element is essential to basically transcribing the narrative that's in the Western space into the genocide space. However you divide the Tamil community, terrorist, not terrorist, combatant, civilian, ultimately everybody's Tamil. And that concept, this concept of using war as a pretext to commit genocide, the context of using counterterrorism as an excuse to commit genocide, it's been already analyzed in places like Myanmar and also in Darfur, and it's been dismissed. You're allowed to advance national security, but you're not allowed to commit genocide in the process. Next slide, Capone. Yeah. And so, taking all these facts, I, with my small team, tried to get a simplified model of all right, what is the genocide argument then? And I came up with this de facto gas chamber model, which we presented at a genocide scholar conference in Barcelona last year. It's called IHRL, and I'll just explain it briefly. So, Nazi Germany used gas chambers. If you're in a gas chamber, you're supposed to die. You are killed because you're a member of the group in the gas chamber, and you can't get out. These are some of the main attributes of what a gas chamber is. Right, and this is a picture of a gas chamber in Auschwitz. It's just right. It's a room with 4 walls. They would put Jews inside, and then you pump gas in, and then everyone inside died. And so, when you look at the no-fire zones, pretty much each no-fire zone functioned like a gas chamber. Now, if you look at, what is a wall? A wall pretty much blocks movement, right? No one can walk through the wall here. And so a wall doesn't need to be made of bricks. It can be made of a military unit shelling at a particular line. For example, if the no-fire zone is a box, and the army is targeting around the lines, you can't move outside of there. And so each no-fire zone pretty much acted like a gas chamber in the sense that the Tamils couldn't get out, and even the injured Tamils couldn't get treated because there weren't doctors. The medical infrastructure was paralyzed. There were no medicines. Yeah, and so you can only get to the gas chamber model if you start the story in May 2006 and you include all the steps. If you just start to the right of the red line, then the narrative we've seen since 2009 is a valid one. Not valid, but it's a plausible one. Oh, it's a war on terror, it's an armed conflict, it's not genocide. But if you started earlier to say, okay, witnesses out, medical infrastructure paralyzed, you created these no-fire zones, and then you just started attacking them. It pretty much looks like a gas chamber. When I mentioned this to the witnesses, they also agreed, yeah, that's what it felt like. I was in the no-fire zone. I knew they wanted me to die. You can go to the next one. Yeah, and so this is just a picture of no-fire zone 3. This is what the makeshift hospitals. Makeshift hospital is just a building. It's just a building, and some of the medical supplies from the prior hospital are relocated. The doctors went there, and then the community would learn, oh, where's the makeshift hospital? It's over there. All right, I'm going to go there. And then they would just congregate around it. Here's an example of the weaponization of food. They physically cut medical supplies, but also found other ways to do that. This is a picture of the procedure to initiate a case at ICC and ICJ. There's basically different legal bases. This is something the activist community and the politicians should discuss. My recommendation is to choose ICJ over ICC, and the difference between ICJ and ICC is about state responsibility. So the Sri Lankan state committed genocide. ICC is about individual criminal responsibility. So we're not talking about the state, but Mahinda Rajapaksa, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, Sarath Fonseca, they committed genocide. The reason I would recommend ICJ is at ICC you can only give a referral. So Canada can refer a case, but Canada doesn't control what the charges are or when the case starts. The prosecutor does that. And now you're inside the UN, versus at ICJ, if Canada files, the case starts. And so now we're back at the question the quote I started the talk with. The moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And so, I think with the right focus in the next couple of years, the Tamil community and diaspora has demonstrated, tremendous capacity to achieve great things in Canada, outside of Canada. And I think if it is the common aspiration of the Tamil community to break this pattern of injustice for genocide that goes back multiple decades, it is an achievable result if we take the right steps in the coming years. Thank you.